This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Roberto DeVito, sitting in for Stephen Laddick. David Shorr has spent most of his career as an analyst working with leading think tanks, philanthropies, and advocacy groups across a broad range of foreign policy issues, and is currently working to wind down the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation's nuclear security program. Before he was engaged on that project, he spent 14 years with the Iowa-based Stanley Foundation, developing constructive new approaches to the world's compelling challenges, including the evolution of the G20, climate change, the role of rising powers, U.S. national security strategy, Secretary General Kofi Annan's 2005 initiative to reform the United Nations, and refugee protection and rights issues. He was awarded a BA in Religious Studies from Brown University and an MPA from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. I spoke with David in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. David, thanks very much for being on the show today.
Pleasure.
I want to start with, I guess, the thing that you're doing right now, which is working for the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation on a project which is winding up their nuclear security program, isn't it?
Yeah. In a way, from a career perspective, it's sort of like I'm coming full circle. When you and I first knew each other, on campus in university, I was getting into the issues of the nuclear arms race, a lot of mobilization around the idea of a nuclear weapons freeze. And it's a different world we live in today, but nuclear weapons, the spread of nuclear weapons, cutting them remains a problem. And the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for the last 7 or 8 years or so, has had a significant program dealing with that issue, and as they were winding it down, they needed an extra pair of hands helping, and that's what I've been doing. I guess if you're a major foundation and you are leaving a field, and you want to do it the right way, then you put a little extra effort into making sure that everybody feels okay, the grantees, that it all goes smoothly.
Right. But, I mean, you said, and I think Russia reminds us on a regular basis, that nuclear weapons security remains a bit of an issue. Why is the foundation winding down its nuclear security effort?
Well, when I come into the story, it's a decision that's already made. So I don't know if there's any other answer other than that, it wasn't satisfying to the organization's leadership anymore. But the new areas that has been announced that they're getting into is cybersecurity and internet governance, which, for all the reasons we can guess, is a growing field. And then another not as closely related area that Hewlett is standing up a new program on is democracy, the health of democracy within the United States. Again, a problem that we can see just from the news around us. But no, I'm not sure, exactly why they're doing this. I guess my job is to, just watch the last of that money that's going out and help direct it to the best way possible.
Right. So they're probably just reprioritizing where they feel there's a greater need, which makes sense. Sure. Okay, then this is a project, and before this, you spent a long time at the Stanley Foundation. And can you describe to me how you describe yourself in terms of your career? What is it
Sure.
that you do?
A couple of things. Well, to carry the thread from what we were just talking about, Stanley Foundation is an endowed institution. It's not a grant maker, so there's a compare and contrast, right? It's philanthropic because it works with endowed resources and because it's a family fortune, and in this case, very much the family being in the majority of its governance. But it's different in the sense of not making grants and being an operational foundation, which means using those resources to carry out its own program. Now, where that kind of relates to my career path, I guess, is key point that I would make, the Stanley Foundation, particularly interesting because it very much plays the convening function, right? So almost all programs the Stanley Foundation does are in the mode of putting people around a conference table, selecting an issue, thinking about the mixture of people, expertise, nationalities that would be useful to put around a table, thinking about where that issue needs to go, what needs to be thought through or hashed out in discussion. And that basically describes how the programs work. In terms of the substantive content, and this is kind of making more of a link to my career path, I look at it's 14 years I spent there, and even beyond just looking over the span of my career, there has been a tendency that I have shifted, pretty significantly my substantive portfolio and the issues that I was, focused on, shifted that like every several years, including just within the time that I was at the Stanley Foundation, because the foundation actually it isn't comfortable hiring experts who are very rigidly specialized. So at the end of the day, I guess I look at myself as a U.S. foreign policy generalist. That what I really like to do, or what flips my trigger and gets me up in the morning, is being involved in debates and discussions about what the United States, as the world superpower, does in the world, and I like being part of the discussion that surrounds the United States' actions in the world, and be a voice as an advocate for the United States to basically do the right thing and be a benevolent hegemon. So it's been a rewarding career.
Right. You said that at the Stanley Foundation, their modus operandi, maybe it's getting people around the conference table and discussing issues, considering issues. The question that I have from there is, what are the hoped for outputs in many cases from these discussions? What's a targeted outcome of, say, a conference on nuclear deproliferation in South Asia, and how would you measure those things?
Well, unstated in what we've talked about, and a key point about everything substantive that the Stanley Foundation does is that it's always about multilateral cooperation. And I think that the best way for me to give a more concrete sense of this is to tell the story of a proposal that I was involved in developing, an idea related to climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions that, in a way, sort of just sprung out of my head as an idea almost a year and a half ago. I spent the last several years focused especially on the G20 as a venue, as a forum. And I was thinking about, I got to know how the G20 operates pretty well. Sort of it's my business to, see what sort of issues they handle well, what they're best equipped to do. And I was thinking about, well, what is an issue, what is something they could do about greenhouse gases? And, close observer of the Obama administration that I am, I couldn't help noticing that the major increase in fuel economy standards, efficiency of automobiles as part of the auto bailout deal that President Obama did during the financial crisis, that was not only the most significant thing the United States had done recently on climate change. The issue of power plants came in a little bit later. Not only was that something that this president is probably proud of, but I could imagine G20 leaders signing on all together to some sort of commitment in that area. watching the G20 do what they do, which often is, all because it's a summit process, right? They, the world leaders, they show up on site and they want to have something to say that, it looks good, right? And so I thought this was an area, and I started, kind of developing the idea. I reached out to transportation experts and got a positive response there, and then honed the general idea into some specifics. Well, okay, how could governments all make the same commitment? What could they promise in the area of regulation of fuel economy standards for motor vehicles? So, maybe that gives you a little bit of a sense, but I think that the first step always is, because as an advocate, you're trying to get either a group of governments or a single government to do something. If you're smart about it, one of the first questions you're focused on is to understand what this ministry or this bureau in that ministry or that is you need to know what the appetite might be, right? You need to know what that capacity is or what that job description is that they have. If you want to affect the agenda, you can't kind of just come in viewing it as a blank slate.
Mm-hmm. And so where is that right now, the climate change thing? Or where did you leave it when you left the Stanley Foundation? Or should I check back in 50 years when the asteroid hits?
This particular idea actually, was kind of meant to be bite-sized, was meant to be something that could be done in the shorter time horizon. And, well, the first problem is that the new government of Australia, the change of government after the election went from climate being very high priority to, not so much with Abbott. And so this idea might be crashing on the shoals of the Australian Prime Minister as the upcoming host of the next summit, saying he just doesn't want to do very much in this area, right?
Right.
But having said that, and having had follow-up conversations with the U.S. government, the Obama administration has been intrigued with the idea. They have told me that it's a little bit of a departure, that the dynamic on climate, has not been to impose such kind of direct asks, government to government, take this step in this sector. And so there's a little reticence at that level, but still openness to it, and we'll see. Certainly, transportation's not as big as the power sector in generating greenhouse gases, but it's an important piece. And so, as I say, that's just a story about how the kind of outcome that you're going for. But I did another big article in Foreign Policy in the last issue of Foreign Policy magazine, which was a kind of a broader critique of the debate and some of the approaches to the global climate talks. So, there are different levels at which you can tackle issues.
For me, and I've done small-scale lobbying on niche issues here in Asia Pacific, lobbying governments, especially at the global level, which is really what, any sort of getting the G20 to agree on anything seems almost an impossible task. Do you find that frustrating at all? Or perhaps do you ever find that not frustrating, the process?
No, for me, it's a puzzle, right? I like looking at that sort of problem, right? And actually, I can tell another story, about people from the aid field, specifically in the G20 context. I look back, I guess it was the G20 met in Cannes, France in November 2011. and aid groups were there, and they were protesting. I can't remember exactly what. And one of the advocates for one of the big aid agencies, I was starting to get to know him, and you and I are both from New York City, and we tend to be kind of direct. And I said to my, then new friend, associate, the protests that you're having, they're just not connecting with the agenda here. And he actually took the point, and the real point of the story is to fast forward from November of 2011 to September of last year, 2013. It's just 2 years. And the same individual was back at the 20s advocating, but it was totally different. He was now working on an issue that was as hot as could be. He had gone from, protesting down on the beach in Cannes to helping push an issue that was really being embraced at the summit. And that had to do with tax avoidance, what do they call it? Base erosion and profit shifting is a great wonkish term, right? The ways that businesses, generally legally, right, game the system to keep profits away from being taxed. Mm. And so I think the point of that story in response to your question is, as long as you're taking that problem seriously and recognizing that it is hard to move an issue, to make something happen. Once you're not just railing against the system, but seeing, how far it can be pushed, understanding, some of the constraints, political, bureaucratic, what have you, I feel like a lot is possible. And it doesn't always take that form, such a tangible form as some of these issues that I'm describing. Sometimes what you need to do is shift debate in a broader way, the terms of debate. Or I felt like for a couple of years in the middle of the last decade, a lot of what I was doing was, this is about the UN. It's always a lot of railing against the UN and a lot of losing sight that, the UN only can do what member states get it to do, allow it to do, right? And so, I spent a lot of time, as an advocate in those debates, just hammering away at, or trying to chip away at that idea that somehow the UN is something unto itself rather than a creature of member states, right? So I just mentioned that as an issue, as an example of how sometimes it's important to open up space to do things by taking on some of the bigger assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was going to ask actually about the UN because I know you've done some work in that area. And, although I'm aware that the UN is reliant on cooperation among its members, my question was going to be, is it just completely unrealistic to expect that cooperation among the UN members is possible on anything but the most banal subjects? Or is this just sort of the least bad system and at least there is a forum for discussion, as you said right at the start of our conversation? Or is that a hot potato?
No, it's not a hot potato. It's like, how do you retain optimism in the face of stark realities? Well, I guess the basic answer is to say that if you didn't have it, you'd want it. And, right, you'd have to invent it if it didn't exist.
Right.
To which I should quickly add that it's not clear that you could create it in today's world compared with 1945, right?
Right.
Another thing I often say is the United Nations works best when nations actually unite. And it doesn't happen often enough, but it does happen. It's terrible what's happening in Syria now, one of the worst situations in the world. And fortunately, that's an issue on which there's a lot more rancor than an agreement. There was, in 2005, sort of a shining moment when the assassination of Rafiq Hariri happened. Everybody recoiled in horror, and the Syrians were forced to withdraw from Lebanon, at the time, and that was an example where there was a pulling together. So I don't know. Things can get done, but no, it's not easy, and I guess you maneuver and look for the spots.
Right. Which brings me to a sort of related question. In the current American legislative environment, again, the spirit of cooperation is not shining at its brightest in history. And I know that you have, your career has been, bipartisan in terms of just trying to look at the world with the United States of America as your client rather than a particular administration. And that's very similar stance to, the U.S. State Department, foreign service officials, not political appointees, of course. And
well, we have a two-party system, and one of the parties is a little nuts. I mean, one of the trite phrases of our system is about fighting between the 40-yard lines. Sorry, American football. But to be contending with different points of view, but not like just a wide gulf. But it's been a while since the two parties have fought between the 40-yard lines, because
right.
Republicans. Perfect example. I mean, Bob Dole, who was injured in World War II, comes back to the U.S. Senate to push for ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Disabled, which is a treaty that asks the rest of the world to come up to American standards in terms of the rights of people with disabilities. And this revered figure in Senate history comes back and makes this impassioned plea and is rejected. Right? The contemporary Republican Party has become so rigid in its ideology that it feels it has to oppose a treaty because of the vague idea of the United States having to do something that anybody else says, except that the treaty is, working the exact opposite way around, as many treaties do, and asks others to come up to our standards. Mm-hmm. I guess you have to put U.S. domestic politics in that same category of needing to be patient.
Right. Okay, I know you have to go very soon, so I'm going to ask one more question. I know that when we were at university together, you did not major in international relations. I think you majored in religious studies. So it's a two-part question. Number one, how does religious studies prepare you for a career as a foreign policy analyst? And number two, what advice, if any, would you give to young people who are, looking to get into the aid and development world in whatever capacity, including as an analyst?
No, thanks for the question. And the very essential proposition of a liberal education, of a liberal arts college, is that laying a broad intellectual base, being exposed to different academic disciplines, and in that way, learning how to learn, learning critical thinking, learning problem solving, that will pay off in some way in a professional career. That undergraduate education should be about equipping oneself with those sort of fundamentals and trusting that it'll work out and make your way professionally. That's my first answer, and since I have a daughter coming out of high school virtually as we speak, I absolutely kind of urged her in the same way. in terms of what the connection is, so all these years working in this area, and on one of the blogs is the debate about whether to get a PhD. And I noticed a blog post saying that philosophy is good training for the field, and it was the first time that this connection had occurred to me. I think, as I studied the philosophy of religion, I think I probably do use some skills that I started building there, thinking about, well, what's the first order concern in the discussion here, versus second. I think the training is good for drawing distinctions and being clear about things. So, I guess that's what I would say about that education. And in the United States, that's the system that there's a history in the U.S. higher education system of large. Other thing I would say as a final word is that I think the right attitude in the beginning of the career is sort of a how do things work curiosity. Seeing how things happen, what are the interactions, what are the transactions between professionals in the field, what does this person or this organization do, what is this role, how is this role or function filled? I think that's how you start to see, how things really go and where you can fit in.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, David. All right.
I enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Terms of Reference, a weekly podcast from aidpreneur.com. Find us on iTunes or at www.aidpreneur.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.